I am never coming back from this. Hunter Avallone's career, dead. It's in flames right now. I can smell the smoke. I also have...
Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Now, I'm sure many old heads remember who Hunter Avallone is. For those of you who don't know, back in 2019 during the Groyper Wars, I made one video response to him, went viral, made another video about him, this one more in depth and more of a debunk, and essentially made him leave the right, and went viral in the process. So I'm just gonna be doing more of that, cause why not? Nostalgia is a hell of a drug. So this whole video is gonna be about transgenderism, and if you know anything about the breadtube sphere, this is a topic that they are religiously invested in, and even I've had my back and forths on it by proxy for the most part. That being said, however, to this day I have not made a video on the topic, but that changes today.
They always do this. It's one of the biggest copes, actually. Oh, well, you just Googled a study that agreed with you. Okay, Matt, if everybody can just Google a study to agree with them, where's your study, pal?
The first thing to note is that this is not really a cope, especially when it comes from someone like him. I personally find it to be just annoying behavior in general because you somehow manage to make things even worse by either reading secondhand accounts of data or just the abstract without even looking into the methodologies. As evidenced in this very video, you also have a habit of reading Google blurbs of studies without even looking at the actual studies themselves. But this is just nitpicking on my end. Let's get into the meat of things, shall we?
Firstly, here's a cohort of trans people over 40 plus years showing that no increase of suicide was present after transition. Although the suicide risk remained higher, this was due to social issues, not transition. Secondly, here's a study which found that puberty suppression and affirmation care was correlated with a 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts.
Let's look at these studies, shall we? Luckily for me, I recently just got my master's degree in social science, which enables me to read studies a lot better than I used to do before, so it's an advantage I'm proud of, and I shall be demonstrating that in this video. So the first study he cites is by Tordov et al. 2022. And it is cited to show that puberty blockers, puberty suppression, whatever you want to call it, is associated with a 70% decrease in suicidal thoughts. Big if true, but is the methodology valid? Before I actually get into the criticisms of the study, I gotta teach you some basic statistics. So the first part of the stats lesson is sampling. And what you need to know is that representative samples matter in order for people to extrapolate and generalize that particular sample to the overall population. And this sample is everything but representative. But don't take my word for it, the study itself states, quote, "Our findings should be interpreted in light of the following limitations." This was a clinical sample of trans non-binary youths, and there was likely selection bias towards youths with supportive caregivers who had resources to access a gender-affirming care clinic. They also state, quote, "Actual rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality in non-clinical samples of trans non-binary youths may differ." The second thing I'd like to address is attrition. So, if the non-representative sample size wasn't bad enough, the attrition is even worse. If we were to assume that the study was representative, the number of people dropping out of the study would be reason enough to conclude that it's poor quality. What do I mean by that? Well, the study is separated into 4 waves, and although it starts with 104 individuals in the beginning, there are substantial dropouts within the study's 4 waves. It goes from 104 individuals in Wave 1 to 84 people in Wave 2 to 65 in Wave 4. This results in the study being underpowered. This study has a lot more flaws, but this video is long enough as it is, so I'm just going to point to this piece by Jesse Singal. His piece has a lengthy list of critiques, ranging from pointing out the bad statistical models used by the authors to their sloppily measuring mental health to omitting their data, making other researchers unable to reanalyze and attempt to replicate their findings. So overall, this is bad data.
We already have data that shows that 5 years after social transition, most trans youth still identify differently. Most trans youth are still transgender.
Bit of a sleight of hand he just pulled there, because initially we were talking about medical transitions, with puberty blockers and all that, but now he's talking about social transition, citing a study he hasn't even read.
American Academy of Pediatrics. The current study examined the rate of retransition and current gender identities of 317 initially transgender youth. Participating in a longitudinal study, we found that an average of 5 years after their initial social transition, 7.3% of youth had retransitioned at least once. The majority of youth studied here over this 5-year time period found that 94% still identified as binary transgender.
Well, someone has to do the heavy lifting, and in most cases, That someone is me. Anyway, let's look at the data. Quote, the study did not assess whether participants met the criteria for a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition's diagnosis of gender dysphoria in children. Many parents in the study did not believe that such diagnoses were either ethical or useful, even if they had been diagnosed, and some children did not experience the required distress criterion after transitioning. Anyway, despite this flaw, there does seem to be an increase in well-being, but this could be due to self-reported bias on the part of trans people. Another point to note is that they do not look at adulthood effects. They state, quote, our key finding that there was a relatively low rate of retransition about 5 years after initial social transition may on the surface appear contradictory with past clinic-based research on what is sometimes called persistence and desistance of childhood gender dysphoria. Several large studies attempted to recontact adolescents and adults who had previously been evaluated for gender dysphoria in childhood. Many of those were formally diagnosed with what was at the time called gender identity disorder. Those studies reported that a minority of youth later identified in a way that might indicate a transgender identity by today's definition. Now, this actually raises a really good point on the data regarding quote-unquote desistance. Because if we look at the data on desistance, it shows us, shall we say, very interesting results.
A 2020 study of puberty suppression in gender diverse and transgender young people found that those who started puberty blockers in early puberty had lower mineral bone density before the start of treatment than the public at large. This suggests, the authors wrote, that puberty blocker use may not be the cause of low bone mineral density for these young people. Instead, they found that lack of exercise was a primary factor in low bone mineral density, especially among transgender girls.
He won't even read the damn study. He won't even open the damn link. It's fine. I'm used to worse. The sample size is 63, by the way.
A 2021 systematic review of 44 peer-reviewed studies found that parent connectedness is associated with greater resilience among teens and young adults who are transgender or gender diverse.
Also, the systematic review is just as flawed as the first study he cited, because it says it in the study itself, quote, all of the studies included in this review utilized convenience sampling or variations of convenience sampling. So, unrepresentative.
I have an entire document here, LGBT notes, where you can see that I have compiled my research over years. So no, this isn't me just like furiously Googling till I can find one study that supports my claim. A very bad attempt at a roast.
It honestly baffles me how an individual can spend 1 to 2 years researching an argument, compiling a bunch of data, and putting it into a Google document without actually reading the methodologies of the studies themselves, only for someone who has been offline for a year to step in and not only poke holes in the studies, but also point out the methodological flaws.
Trends in suicide death risk in transgender people results from the Amsterdam cohort of gender dysphoria. First of all, the fact that there was no increase over a 40-year period demonstrates that it's not more likely that trans people are going to kill themselves 10 years later. Literally, like, this study demolishes your argument beforehand, Matt. Let's go ahead and read this little part. Suicidal behavior is a complex phenomenon that is a result of many individual as well as more distant environmental factors. A recent literature review clearly demonstrates the specific risk factors for suicide in sexual minority youth, which includes negative social environments, inadequate support within the closest social network, and an absence of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movements in communities.
Okay, let's look at the review, shall we? As you can see, not only is it paywalled, but the actual study does not disclose the samples of any of the articles, which is a massive pain. And on the topic of family rejection, I could find a bunch of studies compiled by Sean Last which show either negligible effects or statistically insignificant effects. Also, when you actually look at the correlation between discrimination and suicide amongst trans people, the effects are actually very weak. They do not explain the majority of the variance.
Maybe I can give you a different one. What about this one, pal? This did use a cross-sectional survey of 20,000 transgender adults, aged 18 to 36 years. They examined self-reported history of pubertal suppression during adolescence. Again, this is not ideal data collection. However, it is absolutely far superior than no data / an uncomfortable tummy ache like what Matt Walsh has.
Another study he did not read. Well, first off, it's cross-sectional and there weren't 20,000 people. there weren't 20,000 trans people, there were 89, so... Biggs 2020 states, quote, "Unfortunately, the finding came from a low-quality survey, which is known to have elicited unreliable answers on puberty blockers. The analysis assumed that puberty blockers were available in the US several years before they actually were. Most seriously, Tramadol 2020 barely acknowledged the fact that adolescents with severe psychological problems would have been less eligible for drug treatment, which confounds the association between treatment and suicide ideation. The article, therefore, provided no evidence to support the recommendation, quote, for this treatment to be made available for transgender adolescents who want it, end quote."
There are no large-scale studies examining mental health among transgender and non-binary youth who receive gender-affirming hormone therapy. Okay, data were collected as part of a 2020 survey. Adjusted logistic regression assessed whether receipt of puberty blockers was associated with lower levels of depression, thoughts of suicide, and attempted suicide among those who wanted the treatment. Use of puberty blockers was associated with lower odds of recent depression and seriously considering suicide compared to those who wanted the treatment but did not receive it. For youth under age 18, puberty blockers was associated with lower odds of recent depression and of a past year suicide attempt. This is just one study.
This study's quite interesting. In Table 5, if you look at the association between attempted suicide and gender-affirming hormone therapy, the effect is statistically insignificant. If you look at the subsample between ages 13 and 17, the association between hormone therapy and seriously considering suicide decreasing is also statistically insignificant, so there's that. Also, the authors note, quote, "Causation cannot be inferred due to the study's cross-sectional design. It is possible that those who historically have higher rates of depression and suicidal thoughts and behaviors are also less able to seek or obtain gender-affirming hormone therapy."
This is another really interesting study that was published in 2020, Reduction in Mental Health Treatment among Transgender Individuals After Gender-Affirming Surgeries. Now, this is really interesting. Years since initiating hormone treatment was not significantly related to likelihood of mental health treatment. However, increased time since last gender-affirming surgery was associated with reduced mental health treatment, meaning they were no longer needing mental health treatment.
You kind of forgot to look at the correction section over there. Quote, "The results demonstrated no advantage of surgery in relation to subsequent mood or anxiety disorder-related healthcare visits or prescriptions or hospitalizations following suicide attempts in that comparison."